This is David with High Performance Stoicism, and I want to talk to you about the following topic: study philosophy or be a coward. Those are your choices according to an ancient Stoic philosopher. Now, I'm going to guess what your response would be to that claim. Many people would say that's silly, that's crazy, that's something to disregard. Maybe this philosopher said it, and the philosopher did say it, but the philosopher was just exaggerating. He was so sold on Stoicism that he thought the only way you could really be courageous is to study philosophy. And there's good reason for your response. When we think of someone who's a philosopher, we think of someone who thinks a lot, talks a lot, writes a lot, and they go to conferences, they publish things, they talk to other philosophers a lot. And all of that is true. But among all the people that are philosophers, we don't find, we could say, the cream of the crop in terms of courageous human beings. When we think of courageous human beings, we think of soldiers. We think of people who have trained for war. We think of people who have been in war, people who have survived war, who have seen it all. And then through that process, they have become courageous. And that sounds much more plausible than by someone studying philosophy. So where does this come from? This comes from the ancient Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, who happens to have been the teacher of none other than Epictetus. And he has a little lecture that we have retained. It's still available. And in the lecture is called that kings also should study philosophy. And in the middle of this little lecture, he gets to the point. If you want to be a king, or if you're going to be a king, you should study philosophy. Necessarily, you must study philosophy if you want to be courageous, because you cannot become courageous by any other means than studying philosophy. And that's going to be the kind of thing, even after hearing it from a Stoic authority, that is going to raise doubts in your mind and maybe a little laughter. Well, let's think of why a Stoic would be so confident in this view and what it has to do with Stoicism and becoming courageous. So think back to the Stoics. The Stoics weren't the first people to talk about courage as a philosophical issue. So they had some great predecessors. Among them are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This trio there's no better group of philosophers in the history of philosophy than those three. But here's what I think is part of what's going on. The Stoics thought all these philosophers were onto something, but there's a little difference in Stoicism compared to the previous philosophers, their predecessors, and I think this is part of it. The Stoics came to believe that what is most crucial to whether you are courageous or not is your belief. And what kind of beliefs are going to make you courageous? Well, you see the world in the right way. The things that most people think are bad, like being injured or being killed, you don't think are bad. And part of the process of becoming a philosopher, part of the process of becoming courageous through philosophy is you change your beliefs in such a way that you are not just courageous, you are prudent, you are temperate, and you are a just person. It's all part of a process. And there's this key element in Stoicism which they highlight much more than their predecessors. And it has to do with how you see things. It has to do with your perspective. As Epictetus said, if we saw things differently, we would act differently. Now, think about a dangerous situation. Most people see a dangerous situation as dangerous, whereas the Stoic is going to say, well, you could be injured in this. You could be maimed, you could be killed in this situation, but you are going to be protecting your family. In that case, you won't see any of those outcomes as bad. In other words, your perspective is such that what makes most people terrified by it, it doesn't terrify you. Now let's think about the other ways that someone can become courageous. You are an MMA trained person. You have been training in MMA and you've been doing a lot of sparring. What makes you courageous? Well, you see things differently, even though you didn't come to that point by doing philosophy. So, interestingly, we could say that both the person who's training to fight, training to combat, and someone who follows Stoicism come to the same point in how they see things. They just come by it in a different fashion. And that makes sense. But here is one difference that the Stoic could say will make the ultimate difference. We all know people who have been in really tough scrapes. They've been in a lot of fights. They've been in the ring. They've been to war. They've been to Iraq or Afghanistan. And they did many things where we would say they're courageous. Even though we can't see into their soul, we don't know their real perspective, but we could say, well, they've done some very gutsy things that we haven't, and all respect to them. But then one of these people you say, let's go to this party. Or I'd like to introduce you to someone I think you might be attracted to. Or could you give a speech to my group? And then what happens? What happens sometimes is these people are afraid to do ordinary civilian things like giving a talk before other people. So that tells you that what we say, they definitely have guts. One thing the Stoics would say is, unless you are courageous in every situation, you are not courageous. Now, one thing that's going to be important to tie everything together here is many people think that the Stoics, like modern philosophers, are just about reading, thinking, writing, going to conferences. They were into that, but they were also about living their life and being out there. Think about Marcus Aurelius. What he was doing every day took guts, especially with the statistics on emperors who got murdered. So he knew his life was in danger all the time. And think of other philosophers or other people that were trained in Stoicism that had a reputation for courage in real life. So they did thinking and they did action, putting themselves in tough places. So if you just think it's about reading and writing and so forth, you have to take more action and be like Socrates, who was renowned for his courage. Be like Socrates, who stood up to tyrants when tyrants took over Athens and said, no, I'm not going to do what you say, even if you have to kill me. And he stood up to the assembly and said, people, I didn't do anything wrong, even though it meant he was going to die. So that might be the missing piece, but putting that all together, you can see Musonius Rufus, it looks like you have a really good point. I'd like to hear your views. Like, subscribe, comment below, and we'll see you in the next video.